Hello, and welcome back to the Dot on the YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers, and welcome back to another Planetary Magick video. For the past, I think it's been about 7 months, I've been doing a series where I go through all of the classical planets within astrology and talk about how they relate to planetary magic, the occult mysteries related to each planet, and how, as occultists, we can interface with them. This may be the last video in the series as I am discussing Saturn, but if you guys are interested, I can do further out planets like Pluto and Neptune if there is interest in that. So let me know below if you guys would like me to continue the series. But without further ado, let's discuss Saturn. So Saturn is a planet that pretty much everyone has a guttural reaction to. For most of human history, and specifically most of esoteric history, Saturn has been feared, deeply feared. When we look to the Vedic scriptures, there's a specific book I've read recently called The Healing Myth of Saturn by Robert Svodova, I might be pronouncing that wrong, where he went through a bunch of old Vedic scriptures related to Saturn and compiled a book and commentary on it. Repeatedly, Saturn's gaze, just the glance of Saturn, was described as fearsome. As well, when we look at European history, often Saturn was demonized, if not portrayed as a devil. Saturn was seen as scary, malefic, and intense, and for this reason, Saturn has earned the metaphysical title of the Greater Malefic. But Saturn is more complicated than this, and as esotericists, we know that we do not just go off the exoteric. We do not just go off the outside perspective. So let's take a real look at the most fearsome planet of all, Saturn. So Saturn rules over these signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. So when we look at Capricorn, we are talking about the sign of the goat, the sign right around the coldest months of the year. And when we consider those times, what are they? They are times of death. They are times of harshness, severity, order. Specifically, we are looking at the months like late December, January. What are those times in the secular world? Times when we are starting new resolutions, right? Putting ourselves in new limits, new boundaries, and starting anew. And they are quiet, they are dark. And when we look at Saturn, we extrapolate from that. What does that mean Saturn represents? That means Saturn is severe, Saturn is about discipline, Saturn is about order, Saturn is about restriction, and melancholy is a Saturnian trait. Saturn is silence, Saturn is stillness, Saturn is the cold snow of a harsh January day where the fog hangs over the mountains you live in. That is Saturn. And we also need to consider Aquarius. So what is Aquarius? Aquarius is the sign of the outsider, the misunderstood. Aquarius's opposition sign is Leo. Leo is that solar sign that we see as someone who's very extroverted, very charismatic, very leadership-oriented, the one who all eyes go to. And so when you look at the opposite of that, the Saturnian sign of Aquarius, Aquarius is the one who is so distinct that everyone looks at them, but no one can comprehend them, right? There's been this metaphysical conversation about the age of Aquarius for many, many years, for hundreds of years, really. And what does the age of Aquarius represent? The age of Aquarius represents similar things to the Kali Yuga and the Aeon of Horus that other occult systems talk about. It is the age when the old order collapses and a new one forms, right? And what I'm getting at is Saturn is death. And when we talk about death in a metaphysical sense, we need to consider Jung. So Jung discussed of this cycle, this perennial cycle that everything is going through at all times. Life, death, rebirth. And this matches with the Hindu yugas, right? There is the golden age and there are ages of decline, and then they circle back around, right? Time as this cyclical thing is a metaphysical idea. The idea that things are endlessly progressing or endlessly declining, that is a secular materialist perspective that does not exist within metaphysical understandings of the world. And so where Saturn plays in the cyclical understanding of time and life is Saturn is the reaping of death. And when we look at the actual astrological glyph for Saturn, you see a sickle, a scythe, right? And then a cross. And that cross was added when Christianity rose up, but I actually like the addition of the cross, despite not being a Christian, because I do think it adds to the symbolism of Saturn. So what is that sickle, right? That sickle is of reaping and of harvest. And we look to ancient Roman interpretations of Saturn, where we get the term Saturn is from the Romans. They corresponded Saturn to their version of Kronos. Kronos is that Greek titan, right? And Romans did really extrapolate on Saturn's myth in a way that the Greeks did not. Romans added a lot to it and added festivities to Saturn. And the holy time for Saturn of Saturnalia, which begins on December 17th and either goes for 1 day, 3 days, or about a week, depending on your interpretation of that and what historic period you're looking at, right? they interpreted Saturn as a god of agriculture, a god of harvest, as well as time, death, fate, and all of these things. And so when we look at what Saturn represents on an occult perspective, look just at the symbol of the Saturn glyph, right? There is that sickle that cuts into our lives, cuts down our current situation, cuts down what's happening, and then pulls it out of that soil, right? And when it's out of that soil, it is now useful. It has now been formed into something better. And then above that sickle, we see the cross that was added by Christian mystics. And this is one of them that I like, because what does the cross represent? The cross represents the birth of Jesus out of the death of Jesus, right? That rebirth, literally. And that continues with the Saturnine mystery, because what Saturn is about is death and rebirth, because we cannot be reborn if we do not die. And so when it comes to, as a cultist, perspectives like rebirth rituals are a Saturnian prospect. And I've talked a little bit about how earlier this year I performed a very intense rebirth ritual, and my entire life changed. I mean, unrecognizable. I'm recording this in December. I think this is going to come out in January, but December 2024 me and December 2023 me are fundamentally different people. Barely recognize her, honestly. And why is that? Because for me to be reborn, I had to first die. And you cannot be reborn without death. There is no life without death. And so, I'm not saying like commit suicide or something obscene, that's not what I'm getting at, but I'm saying you have to metaphysically represent death within rebirth rituals. I mean, don't literally do that. That's not how that works. We're not Lazarus, okay? But when you represent death as part of a rebirth ritual, you are representing Saturn. Saturn is cutting. And I want to talk a little bit about hair, okay? Beauty guru era, I guess. So, we understand that hair represents wisdom and growth. And so, in most traditional and shamanic cultures, you will see people growing out their hair really long, especially in indigenous cultures, to represent their continued knowledge. But in some cultures, you will know of ritual hair cutting. When you look at Islam, when you are doing the Kaaba thing, that's the big pilgrimage that Muslims do, a lot of them cut their hair symbolically. Why? Why would you cut your hair if your hair represents your continued growth? That is because when you cut your hair, you're cutting off your experiences, you're cutting off your life, and you're representing rebirth. And so for me, my hair, I do consider a metaphysical correspondence. When I'm going through rebirth periods, I cut it. When I'm not, I let it keep growing and just kind of deal with split ends, right? All of that is Saturnian. Now, Saturn is not just death, though, and I think that's worth considering. Saturn is order and structure. And I think this is where a lot of people get scared of Saturn, because people don't like being told what to do, right? Even when you're a kid, right? And your parents are like, it's bedtime. You're like, no, Mom, that's not fair. I want to stay up all night, right? Think about that childlike reaction, right? The thing is, though, what does the child need to do? The child needs to sleep. If the child doesn't sleep, they're going to feel terrible, and it's going to be a problem for everyone, right? Everyone's going to have to deal with the whiny, sad, tired child because they didn't go to bedtime. So what do you do as a parent? You make your kid go to bed, right? You say to the kid, hey, you have to go to bed. And you might make it really lovely for them and read them a little story, right? And make it a whole thing. But the kid has to go to sleep. And in life, there are many moments where we need to go to sleep. We are the kid who doesn't want to go to sleep, but we need to go to sleep for our own good. And those are Saturnine moments, because Saturn is restriction. That is, at the end of the day, good for us, right? Saturn is painful. And one of the myths that I read in The Healing Myth of Saturn, which I love that book, I really recommend it, was about this king, right? So this king had been really horrible to his subjects. He had treated them terribly. Everyone hated him. Total bad guy. I'm sure everyone would attack him on Twitter nowadays, right? But anyways, Saturn came to him, and Saturn cursed him for 5 years. And for 5 years, he experienced extreme suffering, because it would teach him what he had done to his peasants so that he could then be a better king and treat the world better. And so what happened? He went through 5 years of immense agony. And by the time Saturn returned at the 5-year mark, Saturn removed that. And he was able to be a good king, and then with time became actually a loved king, and his people were happy and they were prosperous, right? And when we consider in our lives, there is a time when you are in your late 20s where you undergo what is known as the Saturn return. This is very much feared. This is when Saturn returns to its natal placement when you were born. Now, I have not experienced my Saturn return, but I was heavily involved in occult spaces. I'm friends with a bunch of occultists still. I know a lot of people who have talked to me about their Saturn returns. And pretty consistently, what I hear about the Saturn return is that it is essentially that experience, but kind of simplified. I mean, it's not that extreme, right? But often people go through hard times during their Saturn return. A lot of people, because we're talking about ages like 27 to 30. I mean, for some people, it's going to be a little bit of a different time. Generally, the rule is 27, but of course, with how slow Saturn moves, it's not always 27. That kind of depends on your actual natal chart. People often have their first kid then, and then of course their lifestyle completely changes. I know people who had divorces then. I know people who have had major career changes then. I know people who had financial changes. Like, people tend to have big changes at that point in life, and that's because of the Saturn return. Of course, some people in the comments are going to go, well, that's that time of life. I mean, that's a transitional time of life, but that's because of the Saturn return. Like, it's just everyone goes through the Saturn return. We all experience that. And yeah, like, what is the Saturn return though? It's typically for our best interest. And everyone I know who has completed their Saturn return, right? When they reflect back on it, they're like, wow, I really grew as a person during my Saturn return. I've become different. And yeah, that was really, really hard, but that hard was good for me. And when we look at other things that Saturn rules, the entire concept of marriage is Saturnian. Look at the ring. What do you put on when you get married? You put a ring on your finger. What is around Saturn? Rings, right? And what does the ring represent? The ring represents commitment. See it? Saturnian. Love and sex, that's Venus and Martial. But commitment within love is Saturnian. And so when you are doing magic, that is love magic about commitment, not about romance, not about having sex, right? When you get out of the lust and love part of it, a big part of relationships is commitment, attaching yourself to someone and building something with someone. That part of all of those interactions is Saturnian in nature. The idea of binding yourself to another person is Saturnian. And I would actually argue that all binding related magic is inherently Saturnian, because when we look at the Greeks, how is Saturn depicted? So Saturn, as we know in the myth, right, his sons were, basically Saturn ruled over this golden age, right, where everything was great, and then his kids come along and he gets a vision that his kids are going to overthrow him. So he eats his children to try to prevent this. That doesn't work. Epic fail. He is then cast into Tartarus, the underworld, and chained, right? Saturn is chained. And there's one famous invocation of Saturn that says the line, Saturn immense in everlasting chains. And so anything that relates to chaining yourself to another person, chaining things together, binding yourself to a career, binding yourself to another person, any sort of binding magic is a Saturnian process, because the entire thing of bondage, and I don't mean that in a sexy way, I mean that in a literal way, is a Saturnian prospect. As well, people who are being subordinated in some way have a natural connection to Saturn and thus have a kind of thing there. Power in general is very Saturnian. And I would say if you want to embody power, you should look to your Saturn sign, because Saturn both represents having power and being without power and kind of changing your social standing in the world and how much power you have. Saturnian as well. Now, another thing I'd like to mention is, of course, Saturn is malefic. I'm not going to deny that. Saturn transits are hard. But when it comes to things like revenge, I mean, arguably Saturnian. Many people will say that is martial, but some people say vengeance magic is Saturnian. So yeah, just that's kind of a dispute, but you know, you can kind of make your own opinion on that. But I will say, if you are doing malefic workings on someone who has wronged you, Saturn is where to go. Now, Saturn also rules karma and karmic debt, right? Karma does not mean like you've done one bad thing and then 3 bad things will happen to you. I do not believe in the New Age form of karma. I believe in the traditional form of karma, where it is a debt that you accumulate over the course of your life based on your virtues and your vices, and it sort of impacts your next reincarnation. Now, still, that simplified version of karma, the one that I said that I don't believe in as much, you can still make that happen by speeding things up through the power of Saturn. Saturn is very karmic. Saturn is actually very justice-oriented, because when we look back to that king story, right? What is that? That is karma, but it is also justice. And so if someone has wronged you, if you have been abused or mistreated very horrifically, and you want to get out of that situation or enact revenge in that situation or help that person go down and go to prison and whatnot, all of that is very Saturnian. And so a lot of things related to litigation can get very Saturnian. Now, the entire concept of litigation and law is mercurial, but when it comes to like the justice side of that and the defending yourself against people who have harmed you, no, that is Saturnian. I also would like to explore how Saturn can be a healer, which sounds very counterintuitive to everything I've been saying. But Saturn, despite having eaten his children in a myth, is a very paternal energy. I do not mean paternal in like the loving father, but in the stern father who gives you tough love and kind of shows you what you need to know, right? Even if it's not necessarily pleasant. A like harsh father is kind of how Saturn feels metaphysically. And so Saturn is good for certain healing, specifically things that relate to shadow work. So Jung talks about the soul and the mind as being broken into several parts. One of those parts is the shadow, which is the repressed subconscious. Working through that is very Saturnian, as well. People who have trauma, PTSD, all of those type of conditions. You can do a lot of spiritual work to help that, and Saturnian work is actually going to be incredibly helpful in that regard. As well, I'd like to discuss how some people get their holy guardian angel or their holy daemon through Saturn work. There's a specific text out called Holy Daemon. I believe it's by Frater Asher. It's a very, very good book. I really would recommend it. And it does discuss getting your holy guardian angel or your guiding spirit. He specifically does daemon work, and he does this through some Saturnian practices. If you are interested in finding your holy guardian angel and all of that, like, I actually do recommend that book. It's quite interesting, but you actually can use Saturn to get closer to your HGA. The reason for this is that Saturn and asceticism work pretty good together. Denying yourself pleasure and getting closer to holiness can definitely be done with Saturn. There also is a connection between Saturn and the sun, and I'm actually planning on writing some stuff that goes into that. That's a little secret project that I just told you about. But Saturn and the sun have kind of a connection, and so getting close to the sun you can actually do through Saturn. I'd have to take a lot of time to explain that, but when things are opposite on polarities, they're not really opposites because polarities don't really work how people think they work. So yeah, like holy guardian angel work you can do with Saturn, even if it does seem a bit strange. It can be done, and there are many people who have contacted their holy guardian angel and gotten their holy daemon through Saturnian workings. Now, another thing that I would like to discuss in relation to Saturn is fate and time. So Saturn rules over fate and time. Chronos, right, the Greek name for Saturn, and chrono, like the root word that's in like things like chronology, all of that, right? That does come from Chronos, so clearly there is a time connection. All things in occult mysteries related to time are Saturnian. As well, aging is a Saturnian thing, and people who are on the older side, specifically I mean like elderly people, are ruled by Saturn. If you are trying to become more wise, that is through Saturn, and if you are doing beauty magic to work through insecurities around aging, that is Saturnian as well. Right? Time is a whole complicated mystery in and of itself, and Saturn relates to it. As well, the idea of fate, destiny, and determinism, or determined future, is Saturnian. The idea like you have a fate that you are approaching, that is a Saturnian mystery, and for this reason, Saturn can be used for many divinatory purposes, because Saturn is fate itself, but be aware you're not going to get a nice reading out of Saturn. Specifically, though, I do want to discuss another thing, is other entities that are Saturnian. So Saturn is generally divine masculine, but when we look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, what does Saturn correspond to? Bina. Bina is the highest spear on the pillar of severity, or the feminine pillar, which means there is a kind of feminine interpretation of Saturn, and there are goddesses like Manat, the pre-Islamic Arabian goddess of time and fate, is very Saturnian. As well, certain goddesses that relate to things like witchcraft and whatnot, like Hecate, have a Saturnian quality to them. Now, of course, Hecate is most related to the moon, but I actually think there's a lunar Saturnian mystery to Hecate. I feel like she has that kind of quality, specifically with the relation to Aquarius. I think there is that kind of connection there. Now, a lot of people disagree with me. This is kind of more my own opinion based on my own personal gnosis and my own personal spiritual experiences, but I definitely see a connection there. As well, I would like to mention that if you are in the Thelemic tradition, the idea of like Babylon and the Scarlet Woman coming to guide you to the abyss that you then cross and become an epistemiss after crossing, that is actually a Saturn correspondence, specifically a Bina correspondence. And so approaching the abyss, approaching the city of the pyramids in order to go through that dark night of the soul, in order to come out a more formed and developed magician, that is actually through that feminine form of Saturn. That is through Bina. Of course, Bina is on the other side of Dot, but the Scarlet Woman kind of comes down from Bina to assist you across that thing. And so this kind of severe feminine has a Saturn quality because, of course, while Saturn is typically depicted as a man, I mean, he is inherently feminine in that he is a destructive force, because the masculine is force, the feminine is form. Now, things like agriculture and time, though, they are kind of force-based, and so a little harder to place Saturn on the divine masculine, divine feminine kind of spectrum, but I would say depending on what entity you are approaching, you're going to get a clear answer for that. As well, forbidden knowledge does kind of relate to Saturn. If you look at certain interpretations of Christian and Jewish mysteries, the figure of Azazel is Saturnian, and if you look at the sigil for Azazel and the sigil for one of the spirits of Saturn, it actually is kind of the same sigil. And Azazel, of course, was the scapegoat in the Yom Kippur story within the Jewish religion, and represents the entire concept of being a scapegoat. Also, there's that goat imagery that is very Saturnian, and hidden knowledge, and because Azazel taught humans a lot of very complicated things that they were not supposed to know, including makeup. So all you ladies wearing lipstick and mascara, Saturnian, I guess. That's me having a little bit of fun. But Azazel did allegedly teach humans how to do makeup. So that is another thing that you can kind of factor into this conversation. That is a different sigil than the Saturn astrological glyph that I was discussing. That is the kind of like triangle looking sigil. We actually don't really see pagan depictions of Saturn using that like triangle looking sigil, that's really like a post-Christian Renaissance occultism thing. They do use the same sigil. A lot of pagans who are more connected to Saturn will have a problem with this as well. Oh my god, one final thing. I can't believe I haven't discussed this. Within the Hindu religion, Shiva corresponds to Saturn very, very heavily. And so all of those Shiva-based metaphysical traditions have a Saturnian quality to them. All of them, and all the mysteries related to Shiva are Saturnian. Shiva is, of course, incredibly important in the Hindu religion. So I guess that's all I have to say. I mean, the thing is, I'm looking at the time code on my camera, and I have more I want to say, and I'm almost a little bit annoyed that I restrict these videos to like 20 minutes. But it'd be a podcast if it went any longer, and I don't want to take up all of you guys' time. And following in the vein of talking about Saturn, I must restrict myself. I must have discipline. I must have boundaries. And so I will remediate Saturn by finishing the video now, even though I wish I could yap for so much longer. I am creating some more work related to Saturn that will come out in the future that I cannot give details on, but that is going to happen. If you liked this video, please like, comment, subscribe. And if you subscribe for 93 days, you'll meet your whole guardian angel, and you'll never need to know who Saturn is again. As well, I'm on Patreon. On Patreon, that's how I'm supported. You can get a bonus video every month, a ritual guide every month, and you can do private mentorship with me as well. I also do tarot readings, and I'm opening up astrological readings on January 9th is my date that I have planned for now. It might be a little bit later in practicality, but I'll be posting updates on all of that. So that's really, really exciting. And I am on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Telegram, Substack. Yeah, I'm really everywhere under .darling, D-A-A-T darling, and I host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, on this channel. You don't even need to leave, and on Spotify and all other podcasting platforms that matter. So yeah, if I'm not somewhere, it doesn't matter, I guess. And yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say. I'll see you guys in the next one. Have an amazing day, night, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye!